Operation Phoenix was an operation to destroy the Viet Cong structure. They wanted to eliminate anybody who had any connection whatsoever to the Viet Cong.
That was a covert operation which we were instructed to carry out in order to distract and hinder the North Vietnamese effort.
Bill Colby is associated with Phoenix, and those ended up killing a lot of Vietnamese people. Would I want to go and dig all that up again? Probably not.
It was, I think, run mostly by Bill. I mean, he organized it, I know. But the idea was as a protective device for our own operations, to protect our own operations.
Bill Colby assured me that it was a reasonably crisp and clean operation.
They just murdered anybody whom they thought had any connection to the Viet Cong. I'm speaking now not of soldiers, but I'm speaking of civilians. And so it was a pretty bloody massacre.
Strategic hamlets, rural pacification, all of these things generally fail in a revolutionary situation. That was part of a failed set of policies. And Lyndon Johnson gets absolutely buried in Vietnam.
I got a letter from LBJ. It said, "This is your lucky day. Time to put your khaki trousers on. We've got a job for you to do. Dean Rusk has caught the Asian flu, and we are sending you to Vietnam."
In 4 years' time, U.S. ground troops in Vietnam swell from 20,000 to 540,000. A former Pentagon employee gave the New York Times a confidential file detailing the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and revealing the lies of the Johnson administration.
We invaded Cambodia, we bombed Cambodian targets, and the Pentagon actually created false books, false records, to show that we were bombing inside of Vietnam.
They mistook a civil war for a communist war and cost us 55,000 American lives in the process and 1 million Vietnamese lives.
The Americans violated the Geneva Accord, the Americans committed war crimes, and the American people didn't realize that war crimes were being committed in their name.
Very few people knew about all the terrible things that the CIA had done.
Operation Chaos, launched under Johnson and expanded under his successor Richard Nixon, targeted leftists and subversive elements said to be manipulated by foreign powers. The CIA had been spying on over 10,000 Americans for years, surveilling the moves and tapping the phones of teachers, students, journalists, and political leaders. Special intelligence units broke into buildings, searched homes, and opened the mail of people whose only crime was disagreeing with government policy.
Not just the CIA, but all of the U.S. intelligence elements were spying on our children. They were abusing their power.
The FBI was investigating groups simply because of who the groups were and without any particular practical information about suggesting those groups were unlawful, engaged in unlawful activities or planning unlawful activities.
And that was part of Operation Chaos. It was to disrupt any kind of protest, any kind of argument against the government's policies.
And it was targeting the anti-war movement and those anti-administration journalists, a few of them, that were bugged.
A lot of people became targets of this thing. And this tradition of setting up enemies lists was something that is long in this country's history.
Mail openings was something that I was directly involved in and that I canceled it when I became director.
I don't think an American intelligence service ought to spend much time targeting Americans.
There is a difference between counterintelligence against terrorists and invading the privacy of your citizens.
The agency had done this at the behest of the Johnson administration, and that those who were blaming the agency should have blamed President Johnson and his administration.
The idea of keeping track of your fellow Americans, which seems to be the most fundamentally non-American behavior you can engage in, was something that was practiced and advocated by Hoover, by Van Diemen, and by Nixon. That's what they did. And Richard Nixon firmly believed it and made it part of his policy.
That's the great scandal. Well, I mean, we had a period of law breaking under Nixon. and the CIA was involved in the lawbreaking.
On June 17, 1972, in the middle of the presidential campaign, 5 men who broke into the Watergate building disguised as plumbers are arrested. The former CIA agents had been sent to inspect Democratic Party headquarters for President Richard Nixon.
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler today called the incident a third-rate burglary and nothing the president would be concerned with.
4 of the men arrested were Cuban nationals now living in Miami. And the 5th, James McCord, was a former FBI and CIA agent recently employed as a security aide by the Republican National Committee and the Committee to Re-elect the President.
Information began to come out about connections between the CIA and the break-in at the Watergate.
There were a few officers who had retired, who had formerly worked for the CIA, who were involved.
I was appalled at this senseless, illegal action. And I was shocked to learn that employees of the Re-election Committee were apparently among those guilty.
When his own case was involved, he apparently was rather limited because he made some terrible mistakes in defending himself.
Nixon pushes on with his re-election campaign, convinced the Watergate scandal has been hushed up. All the polls put him in the lead by a comfortable margin. But 2 reporters from the Washington Post have Nixon by the throat. The president asks CIA Director Richard Helms to pressure the FBI into dropping its investigation into the Watergate burglary and to cover for him by saying the stolen files were seized at the CIA's request. But Helms refuses.
It's Nixon that was the criminal, not CIA. The CIA refused to cooperate with a cover-up that was ordered by President Nixon.
The CIA was being used by President Nixon to block FBI investigations.
And he wanted the agency to come forward with a signed piece of paper, which I refused to do.
Nixon asked Helms to do it. Helms said no. We will not say that that was a national security issue. We will not be involved in that situation. And Helms then lost his job as a result.
The most popular CIA director was the worst one in terms of policy, was Helms. They loved him, Richard Helms. He was known as the Teflon director because nothing bad ever stuck to him, except Chile.
In 1971, socialist leader Salvador Allende wins the presidential election in Chile. It's too much for Richard Nixon. The horrified U.S. leader gives CIA Director Richard Helms a free hand to prevent Allende from taking office.
This is newspaper talk, newspaper language, carte blanche. How many times do you really get carte blanche? Now, as far as Allende was concerned, Nixon instructed us to try and prevent Allende's access to office.
And the CIA was creating all kinds of chaos in Chilean society, economic and social chaos, to give the military an excuse to step in and overthrow the government.
Nobody talked about killing Allende. It was to try to get him out of office.
But we were associated with people who were willing to kill Allende.
They were using private corporations and the CIA and the military and the embassy. Everything was thrown in. They had a big team working specifically to overthrow Allende.
He was not somebody that the United States government was very fond of.
Henry Kissinger and Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, they were part of the masterminding of this operation in Washington.
And if they felt that Allende was a problem and they wanted us to do something about it, we would do the best we could.
And we tried the best we could.
Washington decides to help Chilean military leaders oust Salvador Allende and put General Pinochet in power. A military coup is finally launched on September 11, 1973. Salvador Allende is assassinated, or according to the CIA, commits suicide. Thousands of Chileans are tortured and killed after the CIA turns over lists of suspects to the junta's death squads.
Even the most experienced CIA officers, people with 20, 30 years experience, do not really understand just how many things the CIA has done in the way of assassination or other covert operations.